Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. In this episode of Political Economy, we're finally gonna get to capitalism. But the capitalist mode of production is such a complicated thing, and obviously one of the main focuses of this entire series. So as a result, it's gonna take many episodes to cover the various aspects of it. But anyway, let's just get right into it. Capitalism is a mode of production which is based on commodity production. Under capitalism, everything takes the form of a commodity, something that can be bought and sold, and the principle of buying and selling prevails everywhere. However, commodity production, that is, production of goods to be sold or exchanged, is not the same as capitalism. In fact, commodity production is much older than capitalism. Before capitalism, commodity production already existed in slave-owning society, as well as under feudalism. In the period when feudalism was breaking down, simple commodity production actually served as the basis for the rise of capitalism. Simple commodity production presupposes, first, the social division of labor, which means that there are separate, different kinds of producers who make different kinds of products and are reliant upon each other, such as people who make food and people who make tools. And secondly, the existence of private property in the means of production. Simple commodity production of craftsmen and peasants is different from capitalist commodity production because it's based on their own labor. However, it's still similar to capitalism because it's founded on private property, and this private property and private commodity production inevitably gives rise to competition between commodity producers, which then leads to a minority of the commodity producers being successful and becoming rich, and the majority of them being unsuccessful, becoming impoverished, and eventually going bankrupt. Simple commodity production is also known as petty commodity production or small commodity production. And under capitalism, finally, commodity production becomes dominant and universal. And that's why when talking about capitalist commodity production, we often call it generalized commodity production, because it is literally the dominant phenomena in the economy. Everything is based upon it. So what is a commodity? As Karl Marx says in Capital, a commodity is basically a thing that satisfies some kind of human want, some kind of human demand, and it's something that is not produced for personal use or personal consumption, but instead is produced for exchange. If it's something that you produce for yourself, say if you grow a potato and then you eat it, that's not a commodity because it's not exchanged and it's not meant to be exchanged. The utility of a thing, its usefulness, the fact that it is able to satisfy some kind of human want, is what we call a use value. For instance, the usefulness or utility of a hammer is that you can hit things with it. The utility of a potato is that you can eat it. As you can see, use values are all qualitatively different. The usefulness of a book, the usefulness of a piece of bread, the usefulness of a hammer, they're all very different kinds of uses. It's not really easy to compare them. If you ask which is more useful, a bicycle or a piece of toast, that depends, like what for. If it's for travel, then obviously the bicycle, but if it's for food, then the bread. There's basically two things that use value can do. It can either directly satisfy some kind of want, or it can be used for production of material wealth. So basically, it's either for personal consumption or for productive consumption. Say, a piece of bread, well, you just eat it, and then, you've personally consumed it. But if you have, a bunch of cotton, you can use that in production. You can consume it in the process of production and turn it into something else. Or like a lump of coal, you can burn it as a source of fuel for some kind of production process. Use value also exists in things which are natural objects and not human-made objects. For instance, maybe you go into the forest and you find some fruit or berries, or you find a river or a spring with water in it. The water can be useful to you. So not everything that has a use value is made by a human, and not everything that has a use value is a commodity. In order for something to become a commodity, it has to be a product that you're selling. The textbook says that in a commodity economy, use value is the depository of the exchange value of a commodity. So what does that mean? Well, exchange value is basically the value relation between two kinds of things. It's their exchange ratio. So if you want to buy a table and you have a bunch of potatoes, how many potatoes do you need to give in order to get the table? How many potatoes is a table worth? Or how many chairs is a table worth? How many hamburgers is a t-shirt worth? Exchange value appears first of all as the quantitative relationship in which use values of one kind are exchanged for use values of another kind. For example, one axe is exchanged for 20 kilograms of grain. These commodities are qualitatively different, but in exchange they are treated as equivalent to each other in definite quantities, and consequently they must have a common basis. They must have some common metric, some common unit, so that they can be compared. This something that they have in common is not any natural property of the commodity. It's not their size or their shape or their color or anything. Their natural properties define what their use value is, but the thing they have in common is that they are products of labor. So when one commodity producer produces an axe, and then he goes to the market, and then he discovers that for his axe he can get 20 kilograms of grain, this means that the axe is worth the same amount of social labor as 20 kilograms of grain. And this social labor that is embodied in 20 kilograms of grain and the axe and every other commodity, that is what we call value. These are some of the most basic terms of political economy. You have use value, which is the utility of a thing. You have the exchange value, which is the exchange ratio between two commodities. And then you have value, which is how much social labor is embodied in a thing. If things are useful, but they don't contain any labor, then they have no value. For instance, air or oxygen. It's right there, you can just breathe it. You don't need to expend any social labor in order to produce breathable air, at least not on Earth. Whereas if something contains only a little bit of labor, then it has only a very little value. But if it requires the expenditure of tons of labor, then it has high value. For instance, gold or diamonds. They're very difficult to get. You need to expend a lot of labor to get them. Artificial diamonds are easier to get than real diamonds, so they're not as expensive, they're not as valuable. Of course, there could be like a freak accident, like you just stumble upon a big gold deposit and you're like, oh wow, it's so easy to get this gold, I don't need to expend a lot of labor to get it. But that doesn't really matter because value is determined socially, meaning it's the social average. Since typically gold is very difficult to get, typically it requires a lot of labor, that's why it has such high value. Obviously there are many commodities which at one time were very expensive, such as, tube televisions. But because of the development of technology and the productive forces, it's easier to produce them, so they require less labor and they've become cheaper. So a commodity has a twofold character. One aspect is use value and the other aspect is its value. And the twofold character of the commodity is caused by the twofold nature of the labor that's embodied in a commodity. So a commodity actually contains concrete labor and abstract labor. Concrete labor means stuff like making a chair, painting a fence, harvesting an apple, making a shirt. Those are different kinds of concrete labor. And the thing with concrete labor is that they're all qualitatively different. You can't really easily compare them. Tailoring, welding, sewing, painting, these are all completely different kinds of activity. And concrete labor, it creates use value. But then, what is abstract labor? Well, abstract labor is just labor in general. So, whenever you're making something, whenever you're doing some kind of labor, it's always concrete, right? It's not possible to only do abstract labor. It's not possible to just do labor in general. It's always some specific, concrete kind of labor. Nobody's like, oh, I'm gonna go to work. Well, what kind of work are you gonna do? Oh, just work in general. Like, no, it's always some specific kind of work. However, if you're making commodities and then those commodities are exchanged, because that's what commodities are for, then it becomes abstracted. It's possible to make theoretical abstractions. It's possible to talk about, well, how many labor hours did you perform this month, or this week, or this year? How many labor hours were performed in the entirety of the national economy this year? When you exchange two different kinds of commodities, they both contain two qualitatively different kinds of use values created by two qualitatively different kinds of concrete labor, But when you exchange them with each other, you treat them as equivalent, meaning that you have to somehow reduce them to the same unit, and that unit is value, and value is created by social labor. We often talk about the labor time. So if two things contain the same amount of labor or the same amount of labor time, then we consider them equivalent, even though they're qualitatively different. Say like a shirt versus a spoon. They're both different, but if they both take the same amount of labor or the same amount of labor time, then they are equivalent. We can say that they both have the same value. That means that when you exchange them, you're dealing with abstract labor. So spoon making and shirt making are two different kinds of concrete labor, but when you treat them as equivalent, that's abstract labor. So when you're making products which are not commodities, say if you make a spoon for your friend, it's a gift, or you grow a potato for yourself and you eat it, that's just concrete labor and use value. It doesn't contain any value, it doesn't contain any abstract labor. But if you're making commodities and exchanging them, then it turns into abstract labor and it turns into value. So this is what Marx says in Capital. Quote, "On the one hand, all labor is, speaking physiologically, an expenditure of human labor power, and in its character of identical abstract human labor, it creates and forms the value of commodities. On the other hand, all labor is the expenditure of human labor power in a special form and with a definite aim, and in this, its character of concrete, useful labor, it produces use values." So a commodity is an interesting and contradictory thing because it contains two opposite kinds of values, value and use value, and two opposite kinds of labor, concrete labor and abstract labor. And because it's such a contradictory thing, it wasn't easy for people to figure this out, and I think it took somebody like Marx, who was familiar with Hegel and with dialectics, so he was able to see this contradictory nature of labor and commodities in capitalism. There are even further contradictions when we get to the actual exchange process, but we'll talk about that later. Not to even mention money and commodity circulation, but, we'll also get to that later. In capitalism, each commodity producer conducts his enterprise separately from the rest. He's just running his own little workshop, running his own company, whatever, producing commodities on his own. It's not planned or coordinated on the scale of the society as a whole. It's private production. But then from another angle, there is a social division of labor, which means that all the different individual producers are still connected to each other because they need each other's products, and they also need each other as customers. And the more social division of labor there is, the more mutually dependent all the private producers become. And that's why commodity production, even though it's private production, it's still also social production. Because nobody is producing commodities for themselves, they're producing commodities for other people. And obviously the private producers, they don't know what people need, they don't know what people want, they don't necessarily know what they should be making, because there is no economic plan in a market economy. Instead, they only find out when they go onto the market. Then they find out, okay, what do the customers actually buy and what the price is and whatnot. The textbook says the following, quote, "Abstract labor, which forms the value of a commodity, is a historical category, a specific form of social labor belonging to commodity economy only. In natural economy, which means a self-sufficient, non-commodity economy, men produce their products not for exchange but for personal consumption, so that the social character of their labor appears directly in concrete form. For example, when a feudal lord extracted surplus product from serf peasants in the form of labor rent or rent in kind, he appropriated their labor directly in the form of labor services or definite products. In these circumstances, social labor did not assume the form of abstract labor. In commodity production, products are produced not for personal consumption but for sale. The social character of labor is here expressed by means of the comparison of one commodity with another, and this comparison takes place through the reducing of concrete forms of labor to the abstract labor which forms the value of a commodity. This process takes place spontaneously without any sort of common plan behind the backs of the commodity producers." Unquote. Okay, then let's talk about socially necessary labor time and simple and complex labor. The value that a commodity has is determined by socially necessary labor time. And socially necessary labor time means that when different commodity producers are making their commodities. They're of course using different kinds of equipment. They're of different skill levels. Let's say they're all making a chair that is equivalent in quality. That when people go and buy a chair, these chairs are all considered equal. One guy, maybe he has better tools. Maybe one guy, he's a little bit faster at his job. So he's able to make the chair, say, in 50 minutes. Whereas another guy, he can make the chair in like 1 hour and 15 minutes. And then there's like a third guy who can make it in exactly an hour. Well, socially necessary labor time is the average that it takes for somebody to make that commodity. So if somebody goes to buy the chair might be on average worth like 1 hour of labor. The value of a commodity on the market is determined by the socially necessary labor time, which is the average. It's the time that it takes on average for people to make that commodity. And usually when people try to criticize the Marxist labor theory of value, this is what they get wrong. They're like, oh, well, if I just spend like a crazy amount of time making a product, then it should be super valuable, right? Well, no. No, it wouldn't. Because it's determined by socially necessary labor time. If other people can make the same exact type of product way faster, why would anybody pay more for your product if other people are making it way cheaper? If other people can make it on average in like 5 hours, but it takes you 15 hours, well then the value is going to be 5 hours, not 15. There's a lot of companies, a lot of artisans and producers who are below average. They're not able to produce as efficiently as the social average. Well, that just means that they're losing. They might still be able to hang on and not go fully bankrupt, but they might have to work more hours. Maybe they don't make any profit at all. They're just barely hanging on. That's a phenomena in capitalism that occurs. Maybe they will eventually go bankrupt, but it might be a gradual process. Whereas there are also companies and producers who are able to produce things way more efficiently than the average, which means that they are raking in extra profits. So just to reiterate, this is a pretty good, concise definition from the textbook. Quote, socially necessary labor time is the time needed for the making of any commodity under average social conditions of production, that is, with the average level of technique and average skill and intensity of labor. It corresponds to the conditions of production under which the greatest bulk of goods of a particular kind are produced. Socially necessary labor time changes as a result of the growth of the productivity of labor. Unquote. So the socially necessary labor time varies depending on the time and the place. So in ancient Rome, their tools were a lot more primitive than ours, so it might take a crazy long time to make a specific kind of road, for instance. These days, we could probably make that kind of road way faster, so the socially necessary labor time has gone down. When the productivity of labor increases, the average labor time that's required to make some kind of product tends to go down, and then products become cheaper. And it's pretty easy to understand why. Like, in the Middle Ages, if you wanted to make like nails, for instance, it would be so difficult. But these days, with the machines we have, one person can make like tens of thousands of nails per day. Even though we usually talk about the labor time, we also need to mention the intensity of labor. A really good example of this is the use of conveyor belts. So if you've seen Modern Times, the Charlie Chaplin movie, in that he's working in the factory at a conveyor belt where they're like putting on these bolts and like hammering at these products as they're going by. The capitalist tells them to like speed up the conveyor belt, so then the workers have to work faster. He is increasing the intensity of labor. If you're increasing the intensity of labor, then it means that more labor is being expended in the same period of time. So that's not actually increasing the productivity of labor, it's just forcing the workers to expend more labor power faster. So that actually doesn't do anything to the value of the product. If you're using up the raw materials faster, using up the fuel faster, forcing the workers to expend more energy, you're making it all happen faster, but you're still using up the same amount of labor power and resources. But we'll talk about that later when we actually get to the reproduction of labor power and what actually determines the value of labor power itself, but we'll have to talk about that later. Now let's talk about simple and complex labor. The textbook says, quote, workers of varying skill take part in the production of commodities. The labor of a worker who has had no special training is simple labor. Labor which requires special training is complex or skilled labor. Complex labor creates value of greater magnitude than is created by simple labor in the same unit of time. Into the value of a commodity created by complex labor, there enters also part of the labor expended on the worker's training, on raising his degree of skill. Complex labor is equivalent to multiplied simple labor. 1 hour of complex labor is equal to several hours of simple labor. Unquote. However, and this is a very important point, quote, the reduction of various forms of complex labor to simple labor takes place spontaneously under commodity production based on private property, unquote. Which means that there is a spontaneous de-skilling of labor. There really aren't so many artisans anymore, because nowadays we have machines and things are just easier to make. You don't need to be a skilled craftsman. We have a lot of these automated or semi-automated machines that help make even very precise products. A lot of factory work doesn't require any kind of education or training. And as there is more and more division of labor, jobs keep getting more and more simple. Again, to use that Chaplin movie as an example, there's like one guy who tightens the bolt. There's one guy who hits it with a hammer. You know, it's not a very difficult job if all you're doing is just hitting things with a hammer, or if you're just tightening one bolt. It's very dumbed down and repetitive and boring. And it's good for capitalists to do that, because it means that you have to pay people a lot less. Because experts are expensive, whereas people who are doing simple or so-called unskilled labor, their wages are very low. Of course, it's not entirely so simple. There are also other processes which force people these days to have more education. For instance, in order to be able to function, a person in the modern era needs to be literate, at least somewhat. Maybe they need to be able to speak English. There are things like that, but generally there is a spontaneous process where capitalism makes skilled labor be reduced down into unskilled labor.